Welcome to SAGE's roundtable discussion focused on the barriers, needs, and innovations around housing for LGBTQ plus elders and elders living with HIV across New York State. We are thrilled to have you today. My name is Sydney Kopp Richardson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the director of SAGE's National LGBTQ plus Elder Housing Initiative. So, just a few logistics before we get started. We have closed captioning for this session in English and Spanish, and the recorded session will be available after the event's closing. To turn on the closed captioning, just click on the CC button at the bottom of your video player. I am joining you from my apartment in Brooklyn, New York, and I am so pleased to welcome you all here today. This conversation is timely for many reasons. As we've felt our world change dramatically in the last few years, we are still collectively processing the grief and the trauma of the global pandemic and of the targeted attacks on the rights of LGBTQ plus communities, particularly transgender communities and communities of color in legislation and in sweeping cultural backlash to the progress that has been made. We know that in the face of such violence, there continues to be fierce advocacy, organizing, and change making at the local and global level. Today, we are going to hear from folks that are engaged in such change. This conversation is also timely within the governor's recent commitment to build more LGBTQ plus affirming affordable senior housing across the state. And we will hear from New York State leaders about this unprecedented commitment to think about what it means for our communities. So, first, let me share a little bit of the agenda with you all today. First, I'm going to share a little bit about SAGE and about the NHI, the National Housing Initiative. And then next, we will be welcomed by the Governor's Office for LGBTQ plus Affairs, followed by some framing from New York State Homes and Community Renewal. And then we'll engage in a panel discussion with advocates and community leaders about their respective work across New York State, followed by time for Q&A and a closing with a call to action. I want to thank the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, our generous sponsor who has helped implement the Housing Roundtable series at SAGE and supports the programming and the longevity of the NHI. And major thanks to Tuttleco, our amazing virtual event planning team, who have made every step of this planning seamless and utterly supported. So, with that, let's get started. I'm going to share a little bit about SAGE. So, SAGE is the world's largest organization dedicated to improving the lives of LGBTQ plus elders. Uh, SAGE has been around since 1978 and started in New York City, where we have SAGE centers in all 5 boroughs. Uh, and and SAGE has expanded and does national and international advocacy work. Sorry, I was confused about the slides. Next, SAGE offers a wide variety of programs and services to LGBTQ plus elders in New York and nationwide. So in collaboration with national partners and local community orgs across the United States, SAGE advocates for LGBTQ plus aging policies at the local, state, and federal levels to address the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus elders across the country and improve their aging experience. These services and resources, along with advocacy work, are vital for LGBTQ plus elders as our communities face heightened risk of health complications, financial insecurity, lack of family support, difficulty in securing long term care and housing, advanced discrimination, and more. We know that affordability and safety are key issues for our community's elders when seeking housing and other types of services. So, as a result of the acute need for inclusive and affordable housing, the National LGBTQ plus Elder Housing Initiative, otherwise known as the NHI, was started in 2015. We provide technical assistance and public education around the development of safe LGBTQ plus affirming affordable housing across the country. And we also serve as a model for best practices, as a resource for region specific advocates, service providers, housing developers, and many more. We support building LGBTQ plus affirming affordable housing for elders across the country and provide education to housing and service communities on inclusion And we also work with our advocacy team to change housing policy to be more inclusive of LGBTQ plus elders. So when I say LGBTQ plus affirming, or you might hear LGBTQ plus friendly, this is a growing model of housing that is serving a swiftly growing market, particularly as the boomer generation is aging. And when we say affirming, we mean housing that provides a welcoming environment of LGBTQ plus elders and allies while also providing culturally competent services for the residents and for the community. Because of fair housing laws, which we'll talk and dig a little bit deeper into, we cannot create exclusively LGBTQ plus only housing, but we create deeply welcoming and culturally competent services to ensure our community's elders are supported and safe. For a little bit of context, we see explicit disparity in the aging and housing needs for LGBTQ plus folks as we age, and there's a history of trauma for queer aging generations. The HIV epidemic has had a huge impact on LGBTQ plus elders, friends, and families of choice. This is one reason that the COVID-19 pandemic has felt grief ridden for many elders, both the very real vulnerability and health risks that has been presented, but also the resurgence of the grief that many have lived through with the losses they experienced in the past. LGBTQ plus older adults often say their social support networks have become smaller, and much of this is due to the fact that folks rely on families of choice or networks made up of individuals who are around the same age. Many folks do not have traditional notions of children or may have negative or cut off relationships with families of origin. Decades of discrimination have impacted our aging communities, which was often validated by scientific and medical professionals who labeled being gay or trans as a mental disorder, as well as by explicit public policy. When we think about the time of McCarthyism, the Lavender Scare, LGBTQ plus people could have been fired, arrested, or sent to psychiatric hospitals. And many folks were born at a time when being gay or being trans was literally illegal. And many elders may not trust service providers or medical providers due to this type of trauma history. We also know some other examples of barriers that elders face when trying to access housing are shelter access and safety. The lack of safe shelter is a huge issue we see in our communities, particularly for transgender communities. Disparate levels of poverty and histories of employment insecurity or unjust job loss, leading to income disparity, the lack of local legal protections, healthcare discrimination and trauma, like I mentioned, landlord discrimination, the risk of intimate partner violence or elder abuse that is exacerbated by isolation, unsafe aging, palliative and hospice care, and racism, which is huge as we see in this current state and continues to be one of the largest issues that LGBTQ plus elders of color face when accessing housing. Sometimes racism might be far more of a present in someone's life than their LGBTQ plus identity. And that's something that we need to center and keep in mind when we talk about the legacies of housing policy in this country, and barriers that people continue to face. There's also new research showing increased cognitive decline for LGBTQ plus elders compared to their straight and cisgender counterparts, as we now know the individual and collective trauma is linked to more rapid cognitive changes. For this reason, affinity space is not a means of isolating, but it is a way to cultivate community and space for collective healing and resilience. So I'm just going to share a few things that the NHI offers, and feel free to reach out once this event is over and I can share them with you. We have a primer called Understanding the Housing Development Process, which showcases LGBTQ plus affirming residences across the country. We offer free trainings online around a range of topics related to the development of safe, affirming housing, including cultural competency, trauma informed design, the low income housing tax credit, fair housing laws and marketing, community outreach, and other key considerations when you're thinking about either the development of affirming housing or making the housing spaces that you're currently working in safer and more culturally competent for queer elders. We offer technical assistance, and this might be one-on-one meetings with folks or um, group conversations around filling the needs that you have in your communities, whether it's connecting to a developer or connecting to financing experts, providing culturally competence trainings, etc. Uh, we also have a toolkit that goes through some of the pieces in our online trainings, such as marketing, cultural competence, community outreach, power mapping, building buy-in in your process. We have a housing portal on our website, which offers all of these resources as well as research and other supplemental data that's important in this work. And we host events like this one. We have national events, and we have been hosting a series of regional roundtables like this, focusing on local issues, legislation, housing development, and housing needs in folks' communities. So if you'd like further information about the NHI, you can always reach out to connect. Um, that is enough from me, and I'm thrilled to get started introducing our esteemed guests today. First, I am thrilled to introduce the Director for LGBTQ plus Affairs in the Governor's Office, Ron Zaki. Ron works at the Office of Governor Kathy Hochul as the statewide director of LGBTQ plus affairs during a time when the governor more than doubled funding for LGBTQ plus services statewide and signed into law the Lorena Borjas Transgender and Non-Binary Wellness and Equity Fund. Prior to this role, Ron served as the Director of External Relations with the Division of Human Rights. While in state service, they have almost always been engaged with special projects for the LGBTQ plus community, where they're an integral part of passing all major LGBTQ plus legislation over more than a decade. This landmark legislation includes passing the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, also known as GENDA, Gender Recognition Act, GRA, and legalizing gestational surrogacy, banning conversion therapy, as well as banning walking while trans, conversion therapy, and the gay trans panic defense. Ron has a long career of public service, which started with his leadership in the LGBTQ plus community during the decade-long work on marriage equality, where they most notably served as the executive director of Marriage Equality in New York and led a successful statewide grassroots campaign for equal rights in New York State. Ron, I would love to welcome you to the event today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really do appreciate it. I'm so honored to be here from Governor Hochul's office, where I serve, as you mentioned, as the director of LGBTQ affairs, but I'm also the first director who identifies as pansexual and gender nonconforming. The LGBTQ team in the Hochul administration is the most diverse team in any administration, and our identity in that diversity is important because representation matters. It helps us to look at things in different ways and be intentional in our work. But before I begin, I would just like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Michael Adams, the Chief Executive Officer at SAGE, and the many staff members at SAGE for your important work, especially Sydney Kopp-Richardson, who just introduced me, and the team who worked with her to make this all possible. I'd also like to thank our speakers today, Ross Karp, who's here with me from New York State Homes and Community Renewal. And thank you to our panelists, Luis Nava Morero from the Latino Commission on AIDS, Judy Troilo from The Loft, and Derek Gaskill from Ascendant Neighborhood Development, as well as an LGBTQ plus advocate. We appreciate you giving your time to discuss LGBTQ plus elder housing in New York. This discussion is timely because the number of LGBTQ plus older adults in the US is expected to grow to around 7 million by 2030. Also, people have been coming out earlier and earlier. And so this is likely the first generation that has a majority of these elders being out for most of their adult life. Now, there's also some really harsh statistics on aging when you're LGBTQ. LGBTQ elders at a rate of 34% fear having to recloset themselves when seeking senior housing. and 60% of the LGBTQ plus elders feel they'll be mistreated, refused care, or in danger of neglect or abuse in senior living communities. These are just some of the reasons that the governor has been working hard, not only on behalf of LGBTQ plus New Yorkers, but specifically those who are most vulnerable. As Sydney mentioned, we know that nationally there have been attacks against our community with over 500 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation introduced, more than any previous year. And sadly enough, over half are aimed at the trans community specifically. And they have even tried to portray drag queens as more dangerous than guns to our children. That is why Governor Hochul has made New York State a safe haven for the trans community. Invested not only in the LGBTQ community by doubling Health and Human Services funding from $6 million to $12 million, but she also, as Sydney mentioned, signed the Lorena Borjas Transgender and Non-Binary Wellness and Equity Fund into existence, and included $2 million in Health and Human Services funding at its start. And just this year expanded the fund with $1 million in youth suicide prevention funding for the trans community. In addition, she also made the largest investment in LGBTQ plus senior housing ever for New York State, with $20 million available to finance the creation of LGBTQ plus affirming senior housing projects. With the signing of the Lorena Borjas Transgender Wellness and Equity Fund, it inspired us to make sure that out of that $20 million, $5 million of that funding will go specifically for gender-affirming housing projects that support transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary individuals. This funding recognizes that older LGBTQ plus New Yorkers face distinct challenges in accessing affordable and affirming housing, and often have concerns about being mistreated by housing providers and neighbors alike. I had the distinct honor of visiting the Crotona Pride House and Sage Center Bronx this past week. Help USA and Sage co-developed Crotona Pride House, the Bronx's first LGBTQ plus welcoming elder housing. It has 83 affordable housing units, 34 of which are set aside for individuals experiencing homelessness. The 7-story building overlooks Crotona Park and features community lounges on every floor, a laundry room, library, cyber center, and terrace with accessible gardening plots. Tenants are actively encouraged to join ongoing programming at the Sage Bronx Center. This center serves as a bustling community with an average of 80 daily participants, up to 126 some days. This Sage Center has the highest number of transgender non-binary participants at 12% of the monthly attendance out of all the Sage centers. Sage Center Bronx offers 150 programs every month. This is the types of projects that are possible when we are intentional in our solutions. I hope everyone has a great discussion today, and thank you so much for your interest.
Wow, thank you, Ron. Thank you so much for your fierce advocacy for LGBTQ plus communities, for your decades-long work in state and local government to address the needs, the housing needs, the safety needs of LGBTQ plus elders and LGBTQ plus folks everywhere at this time. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that the work you and that the governor are committing to protecting LGBTQ plus communities at this time. With this context in mind, I'm really happy to welcome our next speaker, Ross Karp from New York State Homes and Community Renewal, commonly referred to as HCR. Ross Karp is the Downstate Development Director for New York State Homes and Community Renewal, and prior to joining HCR was Director of the Supportive Housing Loan Program at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. He received a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and holds a master's in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and has been critical in the kind of government pieces of housing development, of affordable housing development. And we are really excited to hear from you today. So Ross, welcome. So glad that you can be here.
I appreciate the intro. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Sydney, and thanks, Ron, for your words. I'm really proud to represent New York State Homes and Community Renewal today. We're really honored to have been asked by Sage to help kick off this discussion. I'm not sure that I'm really equal to the task of framing this. This is a big topic, but I can certainly talk a little bit about what keeps me and the people I work with up at night. These are really challenging times for affordable housing development and for lots of other reasons. It's a really complex world that we're living in. Adding on to that, the realities of higher interest rates, insurance costs, mortgage rates. We really have our work cut out for us across the board. And as you all know, across New York, many, if not most people, struggle to find a place to live where the rent or the mortgage payments are affordable and can be handled comfortably. With the lifting of COVID rental protections and the ever-rising costs of goods and services, the lack of housing that is affordable is one of the most important and urgent issues facing our state and the whole nation, honestly, right now. Across the country, there's an estimated shortage of more than 7.3 million affordable housing units. Here at the state, we've recognized that the real issue is that our housing environment is broken. Over the last 10 years, New York State has created 1.2 million jobs, but only 400,000 new homes. And that imbalance is a real big part of what we're all facing today in terms of affordability. We also recognize that the fact is that there's far too many deeply set barriers to creating new housing for our most vulnerable populations, from outdated zoning and local building codes to just straight up racism and classism. And that's the world in which we're working in, one where even the most privileged people among us struggle to find affordable housing. But we know that in an environment like this, that's resource scarce, it is the most vulnerable that are going to bear the hardest brunt of all of this. So we've already heard from Sydney and from Ron. Older LGBTQ plus New Yorkers face really distinct challenges in accessing affordable and affirming housing. And they often have concerns about being mistreated by housing providers and by their neighbors. Many of us have heard stories about older LGBTQ plus people that choose to go back in the closet once they, just in order to feel comfortable in the housing that they're in as they age, because they don't feel comfortable being out to their landlord or to their neighbors. We also know that LGBTQ plus people of all ages are disproportionately impacted by homelessness, by housing insecurity, and they're more likely to encounter unfair barriers to living in the neighborhoods of their choice. Nearly half of all same-sex older adult couples reported experiencing discrimination when seeking housing, and at least 1 in 4 transgender older adults had reported the same discrimination. We also know that LGBTQ plus elders report discrimination in healthcare access, which is a big part of aging comfortably. These issues are exacerbated by the fact that LGBTQ plus older people are more likely to live in poverty than their non-LGBTQ plus peers and experience higher rates of physical and mental health disparities. We already heard from Sydney about the trauma and the grief that many elders are living with as well, which, as we know, is exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we have a collective moral imperative to try to help address these issues in any ways that we can. So, I'm here on behalf of the governor. I'm here on behalf of HCR. Anyone who's listened to the governor in the last year or so know that she continues to make access for housing for all a signature priority. HCR is in the midst of the governor's 5-year, $25 billion housing plan. Our goal is to create or preserve 100,000 affordable homes, including 10,000 supportive homes. So those are homes with on-site supportive services. And included in that is also 50,000 young homes electrified to try to help address another big issue, climate change. Since we launched the housing plan in my light just turned off. Since we launched the new housing plan in mid-2022, we financed nearly 23,000 homes that range from small homes to multifamily buildings across the state. And underlying this mission is the fact that to achieve true equity of opportunity and to erase the gaps in access to health, education, and wealth building, we have to guarantee that people have a choice as to where they live, raise their families, and live their best lives. Earlier this year, Governor Hochul proposed and pushed hard on a new plan to bring more housing to more people across the state in every community and to try to address some of the root causes of housing scarcity. While the legislature was not ready to commit on all the bold changes that were being proposed, we do know that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. These are issues that are difficult to address and have been building for many years. So recently, the governor did what she could to try to move that work forward. She put out some executive actions to try to promote some housing growth across the state. including issuing a new executive order establishing preference in certain discretionary funding programs that the state runs for how localities across the state have certified themselves as pro-housing. So that's a program that's being run through HCR. We've also required that all state entities try to identify housing-related potential for their state-owned land, and a number of other things that are meant to try to help increase the housing supply. And our hope is that by creating an environment of housing abundance, everybody will benefit. But we also know, as you know, we've heard some really sad and scary statistics already. It's only been 25 minutes. There is so much more that can be done to help older adults who have maybe faced discrimination, marginalization, disability, and homelessness in their lives, and must now navigate a brutal housing market on fixed, unlimited incomes. And while a great deal has changed for the better for LGBTQ plus people over the last half century, at least in terms of recognition, one thing that has not changed is the fact that seniors can and often do endure a heightened sense of isolation and diminution, particularly when they are low income and rent burdened. And we know SAGE knows this, has been working since the 70s to try to alleviate this alienation. They also know that housing is the answer, or at least part of the answer. Housing that is affordable and LGBTQ plus affirming is a really crucial part of this equation. And SAGE has leveraged this with bricks and mortar. You know, the opening of Stonewall House and Crotona Seniors, these two LGBTQ plus affirming buildings was really important for the state. I think they're still the two largest LGBTQ plus affirming focused developments in the country. So that's really great work on behalf of this community. The investment the state made in those developments is just the beginning. We have a couple other projects in the works that are LGBTQ plus affirming. And so in the interest of deepening our commitment, during this past Pride Month, the governor announced $20 million would be made available to finance the creation of projects like this. And as Ron said, $5 million of that funding is specifically set aside for gender affirming housing projects that support transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary individuals. This subsidy is available to assist in the construction of rental projects of all sizes, from the largest bond deals to the smallest projects that might come across our desks. Generally, they would be for tenants that are age 62 and older. We would expect there to be resources and services on site for tenants to age in place. And we would want to be working with organizations that have experience providing housing and services to LGBTQ plus low-income seniors, like many of the organizations that are participating today. I think it's important to note that we do expect every project that we fund to be affirming and welcoming to everybody. But we hope that it sends a pretty powerful message that we are supporting the LGBTQ plus community by explicitly making this money available. And we really hope that the projects that we create will create some uniquely vibrant communities. We also hope that by doing this, we're going to be able to foster a development community that seeks to help older LGBTQ plus people age with dignity and respect. And we know that the result is new buildings that allow people to connect over shared experiences, fight isolation, and free people from the threat of discrimination. It's how we hope that New York can remain a haven for LGBTQ plus communities and a leader in the right for equality and freedom of identity for every person. There are, of course, lots of barriers to creating these new buildings. A lot of communities continue to fight housing for vulnerable people. Funding sources like HCRs are going less and less far in a world where prices continue to rise. We have bureaucracy, we have red tape. I'm sure that everyone's going to hear a lot about that today. And it seems like the need grows greater every single day. But I'm really optimistic that organizations like SAGE are putting together events like this so we can talk about ways to get this done. So hope to hear some great ideas. Thanks to everyone. Sydney, I'm handing the mic back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ross. Thank you for your commitment and your expertise at the important planning, financing, and state level of affordable housing development across the state. It's really exciting to learn more about the statewide climate on moving this work forward to address affordable housing needs for everyone and for LGBTQ plus elders and folks living with HIV. And this, like you said, I think is really going to galvanize communities more and more across the state. The commitment by the state can serve also, I think, as a model across the country for agencies with certain levels of decision-making power and financing power to prioritize this type of housing and to shift the culture in the ways that we are talking about the needs for deeply vulnerable communities that need culturally affirming, culturally competent services. So thank you again. Now that we've heard from our wonderful leaders at the New York State level, I'm really excited to begin introducing our esteemed panel. These are folks working in housing development, in advocacy, and in direct services and care to address the needs of their respective communities. These bios are going to be a little abbreviated and don't encapsulate their full range of work and accolade and stories, so please feel free to read their full bios on the Roundtable website. First, I am going to introduce Derek Gaskill. Derek is an innovative community development professional and LGBTQIA+ advocate based in New York City and is the Senior Development Project Manager at Ascendant Neighborhood Development. In this role, Derek oversees a range of projects related to affordable housing development, preservation, and neighborhood planning. And notably, he is the lead project manager on 2 groundbreaking affordable housing developments that are LGBTQIA+ affirming. Share NYC, a 10-story shared housing development that will create 32 units of supportive housing for youth, and the Carmen Villegas Apartments, which will create affordable housing for older adults. Derek's dedication to this work is deeply rooted in addressing historical inequities, particularly those exacerbated by redlining and systemic disinvestment. Derek, thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Hey, Sydney, thank you so much for having me. I also want to thank Ron and Ross for your commitment to housing and to our deeply vulnerable communities, as well as all the organizers at Sage and all the other speakers today, and of course the folks at home. It's really great to have so many great minds in the room tackling such an important and timely issue. So my name is Derek Gaskill. My pronouns are he, him. I'm here today to speak in my capacity as a project manager at a nonprofit community development corporation based in East Harlem, which is in New York City. And today I'm excited to share some insights into how to develop LGBTQ affirming affordable senior housing. And I'll be using my current project as a real life example to illustrate one of these approaches to creating this deeply needed housing stock. But first, let me back up a little bit and tell you about where I work and what we do. So Ascendant Neighborhood Development is a nonprofit community development corporation, primarily based in East and Central Harlem, where we've been located for over 35 years. Our portfolio includes 28 buildings and 690 permanently affordable rental apartments that have been financed through various city, state, and federal housing programs, such as low-income housing tax credits and HUD Section 202. Our buildings range in size from 4 apartments to 94 apartments, so very diverse housing stock. Additionally, we have 7 new buildings in our pipeline, and we were recently awarded 2 NYCHA PACT rehabilitations, or PACT is also called RAD for those not in New York City. And in addition to affordable housing, we do neighborhood planning, public art, and historic preservation. So this little map here shows our overall impact and our footprint in the neighborhood. So just a little bit about East Harlem before we get into the specifics about the project to really set the stage of where we're talking about. So East Harlem is also known as El Barrio to many. It's a very vibrant and culturally rich neighborhood on the island of Manhattan in New York City. So many people have heard of the Upper East Side. East Harlem is the neighborhood north of the Upper East Side. It's a really diverse community that's filled with a lot of history, art, music, and a really strong sense of community that really embodies resiliency and unity. However, because of decades of systemic neglect and disinvestment like redlining, as well as short-sighted planning from both the public and private sectors, opportunities have been stifled in the neighborhood, which has undermined living standards and allowed for severe economic and environmental disparities to proliferate. It's also a neighborhood that is in process of major transformations as the result of a neighborhood rezoning that was completed in 2017 and the elusive promise of the 2nd Avenue subway extension, which will extend the subway through the neighborhood, and as well as planned redevelopment of the Park Avenue Viaduct, which are elevated train tracks that run throughout the neighborhood on the west side. You can see that in the rendering here. So all that to say, there's a ton of new development that's allowed to happen in the neighborhood, which creates a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of real estate speculation, which brings a lot of fear and protectiveness of the neighborhood's character and affordability. So speaking of new development, let's get into my project. So next slide, there we go. Thank you so much. So the that one. So the Carmen Villegas project, which I'll abbreviate as CVA, is going to be named after a prominent local activist and a late board member. The project's currently in pre-development, and we aspire to a 2026-2027 completion date. So this image here is currently what the site looks like. The building on the left is Casita Park, which is Ascendant's largest senior building. It has 94 apartments for low-income individuals over the age of 62, and it was built through HUD Section 202 program. And as you can see, Casita Park is in an L shape with an adjacent parking lot attached. And in 2016, there was a zoning tax amendment that eliminated the requirement for the parking lot, or all parking lots like this, which gave Ascendant the opportunity to create new housing. So the new construction building, Carmen Villegas Apartments, will be 28 stories and have approximately 220 studios and 1 bedrooms. We'll also have 2 floors of community facility space, which is dictated by zoning, and a small commercial space as well. The new construction building is actually a phase 1 of a larger project that will include the rehabilitation of the neighboring Casita Park building to create one big complex. CVA is a joint venture with the Urban Builders Collective, who are local to East Harlem, and Xylem Projects, which is an MWBE developer. The design team is headed by MAP Architects, who also designed the Crotona Pride House, which is Sage's building located in the Bronx. I'm going to pause here to say that for any developers that are interested in building LGBT affirming affordable housing, it's really, really important to be intentional about who you're going to be partnering with, because the success of any development really relies on everyone collaborating. So your partners should be aligned with your mission, your vision for the development, and your commitment to the community. Establishing clear goals and communication from the get-go is absolutely critical. And that's really at all levels, from design to budget to how the building is really going to work. You're going to be talking to your partners on your project every single day. And development's a long lead process. So it's almost like a marriage, and collaboration is critical. So going to the next slide, we're going to get into sort of the more nitty-gritty here and talk about funding sources. So the basic public subsidy structure for CVA will be more or less similar to other senior affordable housing developments in New York City. And with these funding sources comes term sheets that dictate things such as design, funding allocations, if there's a requirement for social services on site, and resident eligibility. So for CVA, we're restricted to residents being 62 and older, with household incomes that have to be below 60% of the area median income. We also have a requirement that 30% of the units be set aside for formerly homeless individuals, and that this is the part of the funding that necessitates a social service provider on site, which is baked into the overall funding. And of course, residents are protected by fair housing laws, which is why we're very intentional about saying LGBTQ affirming developments, or some might say responsive or friendly developments. So anyone that meets the above requirements is allowed to apply and to live in the building, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. So going back a little bit to how the funding impacts the development process, in broad terms, it's essential to recognize that our existing systems and the built environment generally weren't designed for LGBTQ folks in mind, and housing isn't exempt from that. So for example, questioning if 62 is really considered an older adult in the context of the LGBTQ community, where we face high rates of fatal violence and the average age of a trans woman of color is only 35, it really makes the age limit of 62 seem a bit arbitrary at best, but it's what the funding sources dictate. Another way this shows up is in zoning and the term sheet funding, which dictate that we have studios and one-bedroom apartments, which stems from a really heteronormative and typical expectation of a life cycle, which blocks us from the ability to create housing typographies that might be better suited for LGBTQ folks, such as chosen families and households with multiple partners. And finally, I wanted to include community engagement as an absolutely vital part of the development process. There's really no such thing as too much community engagement, only too little, and it's important to get buy-in from everyone at every step along the way. So for CVA, we have to go through a public approval process, which in New York City is called ULURP, to allow the site to be upzoned. And to ensure that this is as smooth as possible, we've engaged the community board and elected officials from the project's inception. We also hired a consultant to conduct a community needs assessment, which will give us neighborhood-specific data and guide our further engagement strategy with the community. And we're also doing outreach at the neighboring building, which is what this picture is here. This is us setting up some boards in the lobby to do some interactive or participatory design processes with the residents of the neighboring building to keep them up to date on what's going on and also to get their feedback on design. In conclusion, CVA is really building on best practices from other providers. We've benefited a lot from events with SAGE like this, and we're also adapting our strategies to be specific to where CVA is located. So thanks so much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Derek. This is such exciting news, and I also really appreciate our years-long collaboration with Ascendant as y'all continue to demonstrate a deep commitment to preserving community and affordability, as well as the needs of deeply vulnerable folks at highest risks for displacement. So also thank you for your thoughts that are very exciting to me on the ways community and identity are deeply connected to design and to the development process and even to unit size. I think that intentionality is so specific and so important. So thank you. We will hear more from you soon.
Thank
you. Next, I'm so excited to introduce Luis Nava Molero. Luis is the Saludas Vida National Program Director at the Latino Commission on AIDS, where he also serves as the Positive Life Workshop and Latino Religious Leadership Program. He currently works as the chair of the Policy and External Relations Work Group at the DOH New York City HIV Planning Group and the co-chair at the New York City Joint Policy Committee at the New York City HIV Planning Council. Prior to his work with the Latino Commission on AIDS, he served at the New York LGBT Center, focusing on immigration support and immigration social action activities. Luis has extensive, meaningful experience working with Spanish-speaking people living with HIV. In his native Venezuela, Luis had a career as a professor of political science and international economics at University Simón Bolívar in Caracas. Luis speaks Spanish, Russian, and English. Luis, welcome. I'm eager to learn so much more about your advocacy and your work. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Well, thank you so much, and really, I appreciate the invitation. It's such a great honor to be part of this roundtable. And also, you have heard already many good ideas from the other speakers that precede me. And what I want to share with all of you is just not a formal presentation, just some ideas or some notes that I want them to keep in mind when we have the Q&A section, to keep in mind these considerations in order to open a broader conversation. So one of the main ideas that I want to share with you is the meaning of what is a house, what house means for people. And one of the main points here is that housing should be to elevate the dignity and well-being of LGBTQ plus seniors. Because in our opinion, home is much more than a mere physical shelter. It is the epicenter of our dignity, our health, and our identity. It is our sanctuary, but also our place of connection with the outside world. You have heard many good examples right now this morning about this one, for example, is that it's not just a place to shelter somebody to be in this space or room, but it's also a bridge, a connection with the outside world. Historically, the housing system for aging individuals, including LGBTQ plus communities, those aging with HIV, and seniors in general, particularly in New York, has largely been designed by politicians, academics, and technical experts. And that is good. The point that we need to improve is that often this has happened without a true understanding of the needs and aspirations of those occupying these homes. Moving forward, we have, and we will try to develop the idea of what home means for aging people. But first, let's have some context. Just briefly, two main points. Demographic context and the growing population of LGBTQ plus seniors in New York, of course, is growing, it's changing. Many of our seniors, LGBTQ seniors, are living with HIV, and that is another point. It already has been mentioned, dealing with mental health issues, substance use problems, homelessness, isolation, etc. And all this demographic context has to be kept in mind. But on the other side, we have that the city's lack of an effective response to this demographic shift. So this is happening, but we are not listening and not paying attention to what is happening in the field. Going forward, we have that defining home, as I said before. Number one, home goes beyond being just a roof over one's head. A home is a reflection of our identity and aspirations, a space where we express our uniqueness. For older individuals, the importance of a home becomes even deeper. It is a place where one can age with dignity and comfort, and where one continues to be an active part of the community. A home is a beacon of stability amid the challenges that often accompany the aging process for LGBTQ plus seniors. So for the next idea, we have that some of the challenges. So we have all of these about what home means for each one of us, specifically when we also speak about Latino population or Latino folks that belong to the LGBT community and are Hispanic or Latinos. So for us, it is important also to have linguistically and culturally responsiveness to our characteristic. And it looks like when we are developing all these beautiful projects and even advocating for policy, we are not listening or paying attention to what the communities are telling us. So some of these specific challenges faced by LGBTQ plus seniors are discrimination. It has been mentioned before. So, and also we have mentioned already that some of our folks need, in order to get a new apartment or to rent an apartment, they need to avoid or go back to the closet. And this is a hard process. So being probably many of these people have been victims of sexual abuse or discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation. So, and they need to go back to that closet and keep in secret their gender identity just in order to get a house and not to be again victim or subject of discrimination and prejudices. So affordability. Also, one of the speakers that precedes me mentioned that most of the LGBTQ plus seniors are a community of people that lack of the enough money to pay for all these houses. And we have a shortage in the city and in the state of affordable housing. Locations and relocations. We need to keep developing the idea of keeping people where they belong, keeping communities, not just moving them forward to other or displacing them to new places. So gentrification and lack of accurate characterization of this population. As I said before, one of the part that is not working very well with all of these policies and new projects is when we do not know the characteristic of the population we are working with and that we are working for. So on the next point, we have that some statistic and demographic trends. We know that New York State ranks among the top 10 states in terms of the percentage of its population that identify as LGBTQ+. So of the estimate of 800 LGBT adults in New York State, nearly 1/3 are over the age of 50. And here I want to stay a little bit to develop this idea. Some of the characteristics about demographic trends is that sometimes we measure or the demographic and we say that elderly LGBT people are those over 50. And then in other projects, in other policy, we have that these are people that are over 60, in other over 62, in other over 65. So when we have this incongruency about what we understand by being an elderly with elderly from the LGBT community. So of course we are not probably designing the best policies. One of the other statistics that I want to mention is that large number of seniors spend more than 30% of income on housing. So for those of us that that own a house, they pay about 40% of the income to pay the mortgage, etc. But the situation is even worse when we are renting a house or an apartment, etc. We pay over 60% of the seniors, LGBT seniors, pay more than 30%. And actually, these numbers are, in my opinion, very short. They do not reflect the reality. When we say paying more than 30% of the income, so most of the time we have people paying even more than 50 or even 60% of the income just in rent. Going ahead to other ideas, we have that we are, for example, in order to the city effective planning and response, we need to work more in a more coordinated and comprehensive way. Organizations such as SAGE, Housing Work, Latino Commission on AIDS, LOFT, etc., are doing a tremendous good work. But sometimes the communication in between these interagencies and with the government offices in the city, in the state, so the communication is broken. And in Spanish, and I hope some of the audience speak Spanish, we have this phrase that say, la mano derecha no sabe lo que hace la mano izquierda, which means the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Sometimes that is happening. There are a lot of good ideas, good projects, but with a lack of coordination in between all the elements or the actors involucrated on this. So we are also failing in data collection. We are not, as I said, I mentioned the examples about aging. So it's not the same about having for example, a Latino gay man with a trans female African American. Let's say the characteristic will be different. So we need really to collect a more inclusive LGBTQ plus data collection. And of course, we need funding. Already was mentioned also the lack of funding. This is not simple. This is not something that you can do with just few money. We need increasing funding in order to develop all these new projects. In conclusion, I want to say that living longer isn't enough. Yes, we LGBT people, especially those living with HIV, are living longer. That isn't enough. Having just a roof over one's head isn't enough. It is about a place that allowed us feeling welcome and safe. Housing is essential to the preservation of one's dignity, health, and well-being. Let's keep in mind that housing is one of the components of the social determinants of health. So if we are taking care in a holistic way of the well-being and health of our LGBTQ plus communities, we need to pay attention to all the details, and one that is playing a main role is the housing. So I think that is all from my side. Let's go back to Sydney, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Luis. That was really wonderful. Thank you for your work, for your framing of what home means, a sanctuary, a community, a connection to the outside. I am very grateful for you being here and for making us, encouraging us to think about these things when we're talking about housing, and that we need linguistically and culturally reflective housing, which is so critical. And I'd love to chat a little bit more in a bit about what that means. You really remind us we need to center who is occupying the spaces. So I'm grateful for your work with Latinx folks, with Spanish speaking folks across New York State, and I'm really grateful that you're here with us today. Last but not least, I am excited to welcome Judy Truelo, who joined the LOFT team as executive director in 2014, has transformed the LOFT into the largest LGBTQ plus based community service provider for Westchester County, and provides over 100 free program services, helped increase the organization's operating budget by 400%, tripled the size of staff, and has led to more events for the community. Under her leadership, the Loft successfully produces Westchester Pride, which welcomes 7,000 visitors, and the Hudson Valley Trans Forum, the largest annual conference serving the TGNC and non-binary communities in the lower Hudson Valley. Most recently, and in partnership with Westchester County, Monadnock Development, and HANAC, Judy has spearheaded the building of the Loft's soon-to-be new campus, which will also contain 140 units of affordable senior LGBTQ plus affirming housing directly above the new center, complete with a medical clinic. So Judy, I am so excited to have you here, and we're really excited to hear about your work, the Loft. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sydney. I am so honored to be here with a wonderful group of people. Thank you all for sharing your insight and your experiences. The Loft is an LGBTQ plus community center, and we celebrated our 40th year this year. And as you can imagine, after being around for 40 years, we have a lot of seniors engaged with our programming. We have a very robust senior program called Silver Connections. To speak specifically about our housing project, I would say we identified very early on, and we didn't need a needs assessment to identify the need of senior affirming housing for the LGBTQ community. But we did a needs assessment, and it came back that 87% of all LGBTQ plus seniors here in Westchester County and some of the surrounding areas in the Hudson Valley felt that safe and affordable housing was their number one priority. And we heard folks bring up earlier some of the concerns that people have going as they age, going into environments where you have to go back in the closet is certainly one of them, and is a travesty. And we've all seen that. But also, back to what Luis was saying about a home, creating an environment. A house is more than just a place to live. It's kind of the cultural epicenter of our souls. To be in an environment where people that are LGBTQ plus are seen and affirmed, and their needs are met, is the most paramount thing as far as I'm concerned when it comes to our housing project. So I just want to share that when we started this project, it was daunting. I had never done such a large scale housing project. And I learned very early on that I don't need all the answers. Partnership is instrumental in making these things happen, to making these things successful, meaning our housing for our seniors. And we are very lucky. I'm going to say that we live in New York State, and you know, many thanks to Ron, who I've known for years, and to Ross, and to our governor for paying attention and doing something about this issue. But I also want to recognize that SAGE has been instrumental to me, Sydney specifically, as a conduit to resources that I might need, or to answer questions. And if they don't have the answer, to point me in a direction where there is an answer. So this particular project, what we did is we, with the support of our county, we partnered with a senior housing provider that is reputable and has done this for a long time. They may have not specifically worked with our community, but that's okay, because the loft is there to represent the LGBTQ plus community and provide case management to our folks that will occupy some of the spaces. Also, the developer had been working on a project for a long time, and we were able to adjust this project to meet our needs. So I guess the most important thing that I can say to folks is, we're not in competition. We're all here to make things better for our community, and we can reach out to each other, work together to make things that seem daunting or impossible possible. And our new housing project, I'm so proud of, because there are 140 units, and it is LGBTQ plus affirming housing. And of course, I love the term friendly, but I much prefer affirming. And the reason we say affirming is because we want our folks to get their needs met. Friendly simply means, hey, you're welcome in here. But affirming means we're really going to look at who you are, we're going to affirm you, and we're going to provide those services. There are centers across the country that have done LGBTQ plus affirming housing. There are very few that have done a project much like the one we're doing. And what I want to say to folks is, it's only through our partnerships that we're able to achieve this, right? And that is, we are a medium-sized LGBTQ plus center. We've been serving seniors and the community as a whole for a long time. So by partnering with these other folks, we're able to be at the base of the building and be there for our community and meet the needs of each individual, whether they identify as trans, non-binary, gay, queer, lesbian, pan. We have services that are specifically for them. And in addition, we've partnered with a medical provider, CCC, that is has been around a long time and serving folks in Connecticut, and now will be within our space providing LGBTQ plus affirming housing to our folks. Their specialty is the LGBTQ plus community, trans health, sexual health. So they'll be right there in the building. I think the most important thing I can leave folks with is anything is possible through relationships and partnerships and being open to work together. You don't need to go into this with a big bucket of money and say, okay, we're building this and we're going to do it all. That doesn't in service to a disservice to the community. Find the best of the best, bring them all together, work together, and you can make this happen. So I want to turn it back over to Sydney. I hope that was a helpful insight. And thank you for everything you do for the community as a whole, across the country, Sydney. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Judy. That is so kind and lovely. I am so appreciative of you and the role that you've had in your community and our communities and the years-long relationship that we've had. I really appreciate your work, and you're too kind. And I really am so excited about this new endeavor. It's so impressive. It's a huge impact for the community. You've already had a huge impact on the community in Westchester, and it's only going to grow. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful working together with you. And also, I really appreciate the importance that you state of your role as an anchor organization in the physical space of the building, which is so critical in this model of housing. It's so important in really affirming and starting with a mission, but also maintaining the mission and the community of the building in perpetuity. So this is going to be such an exciting project. And thank you so much again. So now I'm really excited to have a conversation with y'all and bring our other panelists back, Derek and Luis, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this work and about what you are seeing in your communities and take a deeper dive into the work within the context of New York's housing and advocacy landscape. We're going to have some conversation. I have some questions, and we'll also be opening it up to the audience in a little bit. And also feel free to add your questions into the comments section, and we're also going to try to get to those. So I think, I'll pose some questions to each of you, but I feel free for anyone to kind of jump in. I think, Derek, I'm going to ask you first a question on the developer side of things, because I think there might be some developers in the audience. What is compelling as a developer, as a mission-focused developer, on developing this type of affordable housing in terms of what it adds to your portfolio, or just as a developer, why is this important? Why is LGBTQ plus affirming housing important?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Well, to start, the need for this type of housing is just going to keep growing. We're here, we're queer, we're going to age. So there's never going to be a lack of residents. But beyond that, how policymakers choose to engage the community and address its needs will really determine how LGBTQ older adults live and thrive. So for a developer, you're making yourself more vulnerable because this is a relatively new model of housing, but at least in New York State and New York City, in large part due to SAGE's decades of advocacy, policymakers are beginning to really meet the moment, which, as Ron and Ross spoke to, comes with additional resources and potential funding sources as well. And on the project manager side, as someone that pushes a lot of paper and fills out a lot of forms and grants all day, it is more challenging and more work has to go into community outreach and design, and so many more considerations have to be considered. But I do think it's more fun and more creative than just a typical development.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts about that. I feel like no. Okay. I think that something that is a theme that continues to come up is the importance of intersectionality and looking at the kinds of legacies of displacement and discrimination that is rife in housing everywhere. But Luis, I wanted to focus a little bit more on your work and how we specifically can be supporting Latinx people. We talk about affordable housing in large cities, but I'm wondering if you can speak to what are the unique housing dynamics for Latinx folks, maybe in smaller towns or outside of major cities, or just how do we meet folks where they're at in a culturally affirming way?
Well, I thank you so much. And yes, that is also a very important question. And I want to start paraphrasing what was already said. It's about partnership and it's about cooperation. So the most important point is not about if you are talking about an urban place or a small rural place. It's about cooperation anywhere, because Judy mentioned that very well. So when you have cooperation, you can absolutely create a synergy, okay, and then your response will be more effective. Actually, right now here at the Latino Commission on AIDS, unfortunately, we don't have funds to provide direct services to our Latinx community regarding housing, but we refer our clients, our people, to agencies that or to community-based organizations that provide those services. We actually refer them to Housing Work, A4AIDS, SAGE, etc., etc. And I think the characteristic are some point in commons with other communities, okay, is being affirming houses, but you already mentioned as well. So here the main point is that these projects or these housing solutions need also to be a reflection of the culture of the Latinx communities. And when we say communities in plural, it's also because the same that happens sometimes when we talk about LGBTQ community, and we should say better communities, because it's not the same characteristic that a gay man can have or experience than a trans person, etc. The same happens with the Latinx community. It's not the same if you are talking about gay people in Mexico, if you are talking about trans people in some other countries of Latin America. So, trying to wrap up this, I think that the cooperation is real, the main element here, and keeping in mind that we need to listen what our communities are saying.
Thank you so much, Luis. That's so critically important. I think that many of us know that, particularly with the LGBTQ plus communities, there is often this assumption or stereotype of what LGBTQ folks look like in terms of whiteness, in terms of middle to upper classness, in terms of cisgender identity. And we really need to work to break those stereotypes because we know the most deeply vulnerable among us don't look like that and are not necessarily those identities. And that's so important. So thank you for naming that in terms of how we reach people and where they're at. I think on that note, I don't know, Judy, if you might be able to speak a little bit about the programming and supportive services. So what makes services important and what is affirming? What are supportive services for LGBTQ plus elders? Because we talk a lot about it, but what does that mean? So I don't know if you could speak to that, maybe give some examples about your work.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Sydney. That's a good question. I will say, affirming. Yes, let's talk about it. I discussed what it means to be affirming in a housing environment, but we all know we can't do exclusive housing. So we can't develop housing and say it's only for LGBTQ folks. That's considered discrimination. Because, we know as a population, the various communities within the LGBTQ plus collective, we know what discrimination is. But what we can try to do is create an environment that LGBTQ plus folks want to come to. And then you'll find that other folks that don't necessarily identify as part of the community come as allies. So if there's other folks in the building, we're able to develop an environment that's very healthy and supportive of our community. I think there's a big difference between affordable housing and housing that's affordable. And that's something that Luis was talking about. So I think the services, we offer services that we provide support and advocacy for our seniors. We have social groups. We have support groups. We have therapeutic services. And we provide resources. So if somebody is in need of an attorney, We help to make that connection. When we have our new medical clinic within the building, they'll be able to get direct care. But there are things that are important, like parking, if people have cars. Because if you're looking at spending 40% of your income on housing, as Luis was speaking to, you're also not considering the cost of food, and you put that on top of the cost of paying your rent and the cost of socialization and the cost of medical services. So what we try to do is create an environment where those things are either free or at very little cost to the residents in the building. And that's our intent.
Yeah. Sydney, and I would like to add something to what Judy just mentioned. Do we have time?
Of course, yeah.
Great, great. So talking about these affirming houses, and the idea that imply is that as a gay guy, as a gay person, and I'm talking about myself, I don't need necessarily to be surrounded only by gay people. That is not the real world. I think that these affirming houses are more like the intersection in between our LGBTQ plus communities with the straight community. So, as I said, it's not necessary just to be isolated again in our complex with only gay people or LGBTQ people. No, it's integrating all the sides of the society, because when we walk on the streets, it's not all the streets are full or packed of LGBT people. So I like the idea of that is not exclusive for LGBTQ people. It's to mix us with the rest of the society.
I'd like to add one more thing. You are absolutely right. I'm sorry, I get very passionate about this, but it's so important to create a safe space for our folks. People have been through a lot, and many of our seniors are aging alone. We have folks that are in their 70s and 80s and didn't have the ability to marry the love of their life, or lost their partner. Many have lost their partners to AIDS during the epidemic in the 80s, and they're aging alone. They don't have children. So we want to create an environment where people feel loved and supported, and they have a sense of family.
If I could also jump into that as well.
Yeah.
Again, from as a developer, I don't do what Judy and Luis do, nor do I necessarily want to. I work in spreadsheets and forms. But from the perspective of lease up and really creating a community and with wraparound services, the work that the social service providers and the community at large does to make these developments actually work and successful, and make it so folks can pay the rent, but also pay for food and have access to healthcare and socialization, is absolutely huge. And for developers in the audience, very important to get to know what your social service providers do, and to also really appreciate what they do.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all for your thoughts on that. I think there's the both and of cultivating affinity space that provides safety amidst the violence that's happening in the world and histories of violence, and also integrating into community, because we want all housing to be affirming, like someone mentioned earlier. So all of this is very rich, and I appreciate it. I am wondering if folks have mentioned a few times gentrification, and that's a constant in this work. And I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on how gentrification, you are seeing it impact housing for the communities that you work with, for LGBTQ elders, for people living with HIV, for Latinx communities, for folks of color. And I think we all can probably speak to this, but I often think about how, the places where folks, especially in particular generations, led to and cultivated community are not places where many of us can afford to live anymore. And so what does gentrification look like in terms of where people are living or not living in the communities that you work with? I don't know if anyone wants to take that one.
Well, I could try to answer, just try to
Great.
answer. So some examples that we have seen regarding Latinx communities is that just recently with the pandemic, with the COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of our members of our communities moving away from Brooklyn, for example, because many of people living in Manhattan, people that can afford the good apartments, etc., or can afford expensive apartments, they move to Brooklyn. So, and then the rent in Brooklyn went up. So members of our community couldn't afford anymore, and they didn't have any legal protection in order to keep in those places, so they needed to move away. So at first, some of them were moving here in Queens, further and further, to Jamaica, etc., where places are more in disadvantage. They don't have the proper services, or they don't have access to services. Transportation is very difficult, or the commute now in order to get from your home to the place where you work is even about 2 hours each way. So that is one of the examples that we have seen about gentrification. And even going further, some of our folks had to move out of New York. Some are living in places around New York City, and they live around New York City because they still work. Even they are 60 and elder, they still are working, and they work in New York City. So they have to commute now from those places, paying more money to cover transportation. And of course, we know all the cascade effect that will have.
Absolutely.
Sydney, I'm sorry. Thank you. Look, may I jump in for a minute and
Yes, of
talk
course.
a little bit about Westchester? Westchester is not Westchester is an expensive place to live. We certainly have an administration right now that has been doing much better for the community here in Westchester. But we're a very unique community, meaning we're quite large but very spread out. There tends to be, when we announced our senior housing is coming up, and I told you there are 140 units, we're not sure yet if it's going to be by lottery or, we haven't gotten to that point, and that I won't be part of that decision making. But we are taking names of folks that want an application as soon as it's made available. And we're up to 70 people. And we're a year and a half away. So the need is there. And in Westchester, one of the challenges we have is that we are spread out, whether we're the LGBTQ community or, however, there's not, a neighborhood or a particular neighborhood where you see more of a certain population. So there's pros to that, meaning, a blending. But the difficulty with that is that there's a lot of folks that are very wealthy in Westchester, and there are a lot of folks, and I don't mean you shouldn't be wealthy, but it definitely raises the cost of living based on their properties and how they spend their money. So that affordable housing tends to be something people look at as a dirty word. And I really want to change that culture, because affordable housing, many of our folks, we're not talking about just folks that have experienced homelessness. We're talking about people that have worked their whole life, that have been in service work or nonprofit, or, they've worked hard. They've paid their bills, but the cost of living here in Westchester isn't necessarily affordable to them in retirement. So we want to be able to provide those options. So I would like to live in a place where affordable housing isn't poo-pooed or looked down upon. And I really commend our New York State government, our local Westchester County government, and many in our federal administration that recognizes the importance and the dignity of affordable housing. So
Thank you, Judy. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Derek, I don't know if you have anything you want to share about gentrification from the planning perspective. I mean, I know that it's a part of all of your work, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. A yes and to everything that other folks have said. So when it comes to sort of marketing and leasing up these buildings, Judy mentioned getting folks applications before the building's finished and goes live, and getting people set up for that. So thinking about neighborhoods with existing market rate affordable housing, there's of course barriers to the market rate housing. There are also specific barriers for LGBT folks when applying for affordable housing. So, for example, a transgender, gender nonconforming person whose documents don't match their identity or their name may not want to fill out an application that goes so deep into who this person is versus walking into an apartment saying, this is who I am, or less barriers or someone that they know who they can trust with that. So getting folks ready for applying is really important. Another thing is becoming income qualified for LGBT folks who have faced discrimination and multiple oppressions. They may not have documentation of their income. Folks that have worked cash-based gigs or jobs, or that have worked in illegal economies, may not be able to document that they are qualified for these buildings. And I think that's if we're the more neighborhoods gentrify, the more need there is for permanently affordable housing, but also recognizing that permanently affordable housing should not be the default, nor does it meet everyone's needs or desires. I also think, sort of going back to Louise's point and Judy's as well, this sort of concept of like neighborhoods and sort of how folks get pushed out and pushed around the city also sort of brings it back to like, and also that folks are living their whole lives as being out. I don't think like that LGBT affirming housing should be specific to just traditional neighborhoods. I think one of the reasons why we've hired a consultant to do a community needs assessment is to sort of prove that there is a need within the community that we're already working in to create LGBT affirming housing, even though it's not a traditional neighborhood. And also that folks have multiple identities, and LGBT may not be their leading identity, so they want to live in a culturally competent neighborhood in a different way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Derek. I think that's so critically important, and in particular, thinking about the ways that neighborhoods have changed over the last 50 years, particularly for Black communities, for Black queer communities, and the people that have been pushed out from communities that they have lived in all of their lives. These are all such critically important things to think about when we're talking about housing access. There's a question in the chat about marketing, and I don't know, Derek, you might want to answer this, not sure, but in terms of the marketing process, so Greg asked, is it marketing mostly to LGBTQ plus community a way around discriminating, I'm assuming, against straight or cisgender people, so that it's a first come, first serve way to get folks into the building? I don't know if you could share a little bit more about the marketing / lease up process, and if that's a way to get to folks that might be vulnerable and not accessing housing in the same ways.
Sure. I wouldn't use it as a way to get around. We're not getting around anything. Like I said in my presentation, anyone who meets these basic basic requirements are allowed to apply and are allowed to live there. Instead of thinking as a way to get around, I think thinking of it as a way of recognizing a community-specific need is a better way of framing it. And again, this happens with all these type of new affordable buildings because there is such a need for senior affordable housing generally. So so people have been doing this for a long time. This often is organized by churches. This is just recognizing that there's a need to reach out to this specific community because there is a large need for this type of housing. And maybe Judy, you want to jump in as well on that?
I agree with you 100% with everything that you said. I think it's important to let our communities know, and through an LGBT center, an LGBT specific organization, you can definitely do outreach. But it's important to note that we need to look at the bigger picture when it comes to discrimination. We don't want to be discriminated against, and we don't want others to be discriminated against. I will say we're very fortunate in New York that we have the Division of Human Rights. And here in Westchester, we have the Human Rights Commission that focuses a lot of their energy on fair housing. So when folks feel like there may be an issue going on when they're trying to rent, whether it's affordable housing or anywhere, they do have places to go to address it.
Thank you so much. There's also a few questions about multi-generational housing. And so David was asking about, knowing that there's funding sources limited to housing for 62 plus and the kinds of conversations that we've had around the subjectivity of aging, depending on various identities, not just LGBTQ plus identity, but issues of race and country of origin, and the vulnerability around the aging process. What are the possibilities around intergenerational living and the benefits on the senior population? And are there any efforts underway to influence policymakers to unlock funding sources for affirming housing for multi-generations? And I also want to welcome Jim Harvey of One Roof Chicago. The folks at One Roof Chicago are doing an amazing project, building, I believe, still on the south side of Chicago, and including job training and multi-generational services and housing. So want to uplift the work that One Roof has been doing at the grassroots level for years now, and really appreciative of your work. But wonder if anyone here could speak to anything around multi-generational housing or efforts towards multi-generational housing that you are aware of.
I would love to develop multi-generational housing. I've heard of it being done in certain areas on smaller scales. If anyone's out there and this is something they're interested in doing, I'm interested in talking about it. This is specifically to senior housing, but we do have a younger generation of folks that are seriously in need of housing as well. So I can't offer a lot on experience with it, except for I see it as a need. And I think we do have programming here at the Loft that's intergenerational. And I think everybody benefits from that experience. A younger generation learns, and an older generation feels uplifted by a younger generation of folks and their thoughts and perspectives. So I think it's a wonderful idea. I don't know how to get there, but if anyone there is interested in working on it, give me a call.
I want to echo what Judy mentioned. Yes, I don't have any specific information about policies, and we know that politics go ups and down depending who is sitting or making the decisions. So I don't have any specific information, but I love as well the idea of multi-generations working together, not only in housing. For example, at Latino Commission on AIDS, we have also Oasis Wellness Center, or LGBTQ Community Center, where all not all, most of our activities are focused on multi-generations activities. So we have a specific groups for young people, we have a specific groups for elderlies, but also we have activities together. So because of course it's not about isolating elderly from young people or young people from elderly. So one day these young people will be older, and so the idea is, yes, I would love to have more information about multi-generations initiatives. And after you call Judy, call me please too.
Yeah. And I'll call you too.
Yeah, I don't have experience with those specific funding sources. I know that projects have been done. In relation to the CVA project, we also are in pre-development of a supportive housing for youth ages 16 to 24 that is LGBT affirming. That's about a 10-minute walk away from the CVA project. And I think it's sort of a secret hope or desire that once both buildings are completed and leased up, that there'll be synergies between the two buildings and the two communities. Because yeah, it's absolutely important for both populations to be mixing together.
Yeah.
Thank you. This conversation is making me think about, representation. And I think that everyone here is talking deeply about how community voice and the leadership of communities need to be at the center of these planning processes. So we do have a question from the audience. It's clear that you speak with LGBTQ plus community members in your planning and development. What do those conversations look like? And how do you identify the community members who should participate? So what I'm gathering from that is, what does the outreach look like? What do the conversations look like? What does community outreach mean? Because it can look many different ways, right? So I don't know if someone wants to let's start at that one.
I will say from my perspective as the leader of an LGBTQ plus community center that the first place we had to start, especially if you're looking to pursue funding, is a formal needs assessment. So the first thing I did when, we're listening to the community when they're in groups, when they're here, when they catch your ears saying, gosh, we need housing, and you hear it enough. You not only know it, you hear it enough. You say, wow, we need to capture the voices of our community and find out specifically what their needs are. So what I did is I pursued funding for a formal needs assessment. So after we were able to get a little bit of funding to do a formal needs assessment, we, through our existing programming, were able to reach out to our, 10,000, 12,000 participants and say, we're doing a needs assessment. It started with focus groups. Let's talk. So we had these different intersections of our community, different age groups, different identities, get together and talk, different locations within the county, and talk about what those needs are. And then we saw what the commonality was and developed a survey. And we did this with a professional organization that does needs assessments. So the data was confirmed, and that's how we were able to really capture the voices of the community to move forward and pursue the project.
Yes, totally agree with what Judy said. Totally agree. And I would like just to add that, for example, Judy was talking about the formal way of capturing these voices, but also there are informal ways. I mean, not formal, not structured. When you have social activities at your center, social activities in different support groups, you can develop very short surveys as well in order to get that information. And once you get all the information in a formal or non-formal way, the next step, I would say, is just amplifying these voices, putting all of this in a document, and then start, number one, from our point of view at Latino Commission, is advocating for resources, for funding. And then professional people will work in development areas, so in order to try to get a solution for this.
And I would just add that that was wonderful. Absolutely on point. I would just add that if there are developers out there and you're looking to develop a project in your area, connect with your local LGBTQ center or organization, because that is where the folks are taking advantage of the services provided. And if you get them on board as a partnership in some way, they'll be able to reach the community and clearly get the needs directly from the community, which will help you with your project.
Yeah, and as a developer, listen to the folks who actually work with the community day in and day out.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. That's all really great information. I think that, you know, sometimes we can talk about like community engagement in very broad terms. And I think it's really important to think about which community, you know, if your go-to, not that community boards aren't great, but if your go-to is the community board and there are only a certain group of people or there's certain demographics that are the loudest at the community board, who is being counted and heard? And I think that that's something to really think about when you're thinking about, particularly like Luis mentioned, meeting folks that are Spanish speaking, meeting Black community members, folks that might not be going to the LGBTQ plus centers, but exist in the community. Where are they, and where do they congregate, and what is the culturally affirming space to meet them where they're at? And so I think we really need to think about those things, and I appreciate the intentionality you all bring to that part of the work. Let's see. Folks always have questions about financing and funding, and I know that's a huge piece of it in terms of more of like the specific housing development world. Can folks provide any kinds of insight into what your kind of financing process is, or what are some financing struggles that you have met? You know, are you using the LIHTC funding? Are you how do you access gap financing? Are you thinking about philanthropic grants? You know, like anything about, this is probably too broad, but like, what has the financing process felt like in terms of this specific development, this type of development? Because I know it can feel, it's a beast. And so I don't know if you have any points for people that are in the beginning of this development process.
I sure do. Because I've gone through it, and in the beginning, I honestly felt as if, how are we going to achieve this? It is quite a lot, the need and the support financially. But I would say your relationships, it depends on where you're living in the country and what the local elected officials, what their priorities are. But I would start with connecting with folks, doing a little research about your representation in your area and who is on board for affordable housing, who's on board for inclusion, who's on board for the LGBTQ plus community, if that's the kind of housing you're talking about, and set up meetings with them and start understanding what their access is to funds. And if you start there and you continue with that, you'll see, even if they don't have funds available to you, they'll be able to identify some resources. There is private funding out there, meaning foundations that aren't government. As a nonprofit, you have access to rights to do some grant writing. But there's also a component to what we do as an LGBT center that has to do with a capital campaign. and raising money through supporters in our community that believe in our mission. So that I would start with your relationships. And if you don't have relationships with your local elected officials, I would say develop them and get to know about them. Do a little research and see who has a like mind. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that. I mean, from the developer perspective, you know, the buildings that we're building when it comes to sort of the nuts and bolts, the structure, all of that isn't any different than any other affordable housing development that, you know, has funding sources from city, state, federal, et cetera. When it comes to seniors, it's through HUD. So the nuts and bolts on my end and how it looks as a spreadsheet isn't that much different. But where it really comes in is the partnership between the social service provider, the LGBT organization, and the developer. So I assume it's probably harder for the LGBT organizations to find a good developer than it is for the developer to find the LGBT organizations. But making sure you're aligned on your mission and you're both willing to really fight for the funding that the development needs, and that the language that you use is aligned, so that when you do go before electeds, when you do go for grants or capital funding, that you all are saying the same message and are staying on point and are completely unified.
Yeah. And
Great.
I would like also to add, listening to both of you guys, so is the, as Judy mentioned, relationship, but also looks like, I mean, do your research about what community-based organizations can support your project, because that is another. It's not only politicians that are in offices at that moment, but also community-based organizations that can help you supporting. Number one, doing advocacy for the project, because the project is in there to provide services or to try to get an answer or a solution for a problem. So, and we CBOs, we advocate for those solutions. So, besides politicians, which is a perfect recommendation, besides the funds, which is another great recommendation, look also for the community-based organizations that can support your project.
Absolutely. It's so critical, and it's often I think like piecing a puzzle together, tiny pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that we're getting close to the end, but you know, there's something that I wanted to address and see if anyone had more thoughts on this. There is clearly rampant transphobia happening in the cultural backlash, legislatively right now, culturally in the current moment. I'm wondering if anyone can speak to how you believe we can better address the needs of trans elders and trans folks living with HIV in housing, in service provision, in advocacy, whether it's in urban areas or across the diverse landscape of New York State, because we are in a current moment. And I think it is important to name and recognize that trans elders exist and have always existed. And then there is a certain level of invisibility that can happen around that.
Well, I would say just very shortly, meaningful involving these communities in order to get the solutions. And when I say meaningful involving or incorporating them, it's not just because they sit in a board committee, etc. No, it's listening to the people on the streets where they are. So involving them in a meaningful way. Sometimes our communities are not aware of the ways we can get in order to solve the problems we have, the social problems we have. So we need to tell them and educate them. Your voice is important, and we community, for example, talking from the CBO point of view, is community-based organizations are here to amplify your voice, but we are not the voice. We are the way of amplifying your voice and making that voice to be heard or listened in the correct place.
Thank you, Louise.
For me, at an LGBT center, which I'm so proud of the work we do at the Loft, we have a lot of TGN, trans, gender nonconforming, and gender neutral services available here at the Loft. And many people aren't going to have the opportunity that we have in staffing, but I pride myself on the diversity of our staff, and that our entire staff is part of the community we serve. There are different identities, but to make sure we lift up trans folks and we listen to their experiences and we lift them up into positions that make decisions directly for the community. So I think it's really important, as Luis was saying, to be the conduit, not the the voice, to be able to hand the microphone over to folks, whatever their identity is, and allow them to express it and give them the opportunity to be seen and to be heard without speaking for them. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you.
Yeah, all of that. And just to add, nurturing folks to take on leadership positions and careers doing this so they can actually be the ones driving things forward. As a trans person, building housing for trans youth that I would have been able to apply for is a dream, really. But also I got very, very lucky to be here.
Yeah. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Derek.
Well, I wish that we could continue having this conversation. I think that we're almost at time, and I think we're going to wrap up the Q&A for now. But if you want to continue this conversation, please reach out to myself. I'm happy to connect or direct you to any of our wonderful guests today. I want to again thank you, Derek, Luis, and Judy, for your incredible work dedicated to the safety and the wellness and the housing for LGBTQ plus elders in your respective communities, and for joining us in this rich and critically important conversation today. Thank you so much. I also want to thank Ron and Ross for being here earlier, and our hope is that this conversation can ground us in the continued advocacy and work of fierce advocates and leaders finding ways to continue to come together to ensure the housing and safety needs of our communities are visible across New York. And I just wanted to share a few of the takeaways that I think are great for us to think about as we're leaving and continuing this conversation. This is a challenging time for housing development in New York State. With lifting the COVID rental protections and the trauma of the recent pandemic, affordable housing is one of the biggest issues facing older adults in the state. And the governor has made affordable housing development a priority and is working to develop affirming housing. Collaboration is critical for this development process. So, talking to the partners that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, this type of housing development takes time and intentionality, and the partnerships you make are so incredibly important. Something that I really appreciate is that Luis reminded us that home is such more than a roof over our head. It's stability, it's identity, it's safety, and it's so much more. So, providing affordable housing means creating safety and space for an aging person to have stability and a sense of self. And this is why culturally competent and inclusive services are really important for older adults. We spoke a lot about community engagement and how it's vital in the development process. So, getting buy in at every step of the way from community members, from leaders, from advocates, thinking about the success of a development and what neighborhood are you in or are you going into, and who is a part of that neighborhood, who has been displaced from that neighborhood, and thinking about strategic partnerships. So, cooperation can really help you connect to the target communities you're hoping to work with to support, especially if you're trying to connect to LGBTQ plus communities and other intersectional identities. And Judy reminded us that anything is possible with relationships and with partnerships. So finding the best of the best. And, we know that housing is historically rife and historically a site in many ways of displacement and violence. So how can we do this to try to rectify the wrongs that have happened in the names of housing in this country? It's so critical for this type of housing to be mission aligned and also to connect to a mission oriented partners, community organizations, and to have an anchor organization if you're providing services for the residents and for the surrounding community, to build an affirming culture, not just for LGBTQ plus elders, but for people around their various identities that they bring to a space. We have information around the contact details for all of our folks today. If folks are interested specifically in the housing that's being built at the Loft and the White Plains Project, there's a link on the Loft's website. And in closing, I want to leave us with some words of possibility amidst the grief that's really heavy in the world right now and our communities during this time. So I think everyone today reminded me that folks are working to create housing and, as Luis stated, home amidst trauma and systems failures, and also working to create and cultivate joy and hope and power in community. And if the pandemic has reminded me of anything personally, it's that we take care of each other and that meaning making has to be a part of it always. So you are all here for this reason. And that's phenomenal in terms of reminding ourselves as a community reminder to ground us in this work moving forward. So we hope to be continuing to be grounded in this foundation of hope and love. Thank you for your commitment to the housing, the advocacy, and the wellness of LGBTQ plus elders and of elders living with HIV across the state. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to hearing from folks soon.